Now, we can be proud of our high democratic standards, but we mustn't ignore the worrying state of press freedom around the world. It's a trend that is also now affecting Europe. The European Media Freedom Act is a decisive instrument to address these challenges. Media is not just any old business. Over and above the economic side of things, media is part of education, cultural development and inclusivity in our societies, and it protects basic rights like freedom of speech and access to information. As such, media services' dual role has to be recognised in the European Media Freedom Act. We have a balanced text that does justice to that dual role and protects the media from external influence. We've made it sure that the media surveillance is politically independent. We've created transparency about ownership, and we've guaranteed working minimum standards for journalists. Media service providers should also be able to go to the European level when national regulations make it impossible for them to do their work. In addition, we have included the big online platforms who act as gatekeepers in our digital lives. These mostly non-European platforms have a lot of power to decide what sort of content gets to us or not. European media content is strictly regulated and shouldn't be subject to the arbitrary decisions of these platforms. We've seen many cases where serious and legal content has been blocked, and that shows us that we need this protective mechanism. This mechanism does not apply, this guarantee doesn't apply for illegal content. The DSA remains untouched. We're talking here about protecting quality journalism, scientific articles and investigative journalists. Shouldn't be subject to the arbitrary decisions of big platforms. We as MEPs can now show whether we are serious about protecting the media. Media is already regulated. There's media surveillance, recognised regulation mechanisms already in Europe, or whether we want self-regulation. Now, we've achieved a number of legislative milestones. We've got anti-SLAPP with the DSA, the DMA, AVMD, or the Copyright Directive. Now what we have to do is to make the media and journalists, give them security about diversity and freedom. And the European Media Act represents a further step in protecting our media and democracy, and I therefore ask you to give it your support in the vote this afternoon.
Thank you very much. For the Committee on the Internal Market and Consumer Protection, I give the floor to Geoffroy Didier, please.
La liberté d'expression est un bien.
Freedom of expression is too fragile for it to be ignored. Thanks to the Digital Services Act, and I was one of the European Parliament rapporteurs for this, and it's been enforced since the 25th of August. Internet search engines have the legal requirement to suppress any clearly illegal content, such as cyberbullying. You cannot harass or threaten anyone. Thanks to the Media Freedom Act, where it was also my honour to be one of the rapporteurs, we consolidate this freedom of expression. However, this time we prevent social networks themselves from arbitrary takedown of content or information just because they are not in line with their general rules of use or because of the ideology of the owners of the network. So what this means, for instance, is that Twitter cannot delete the accounts of certain journalists. Hatred is illegal, but censorship is something different. We're not the American model, which lets people say anything they want, nor are we the Chinese model, which doesn't let people say anything. This is the European cultural model.
Thank you very much. And now for the Committee on Civil Liberties, Justice and Home Affairs, Ramona Strugaro, please.
The European Media Freedom Act was not born from our mere appetite to create a sandbox to test our ability to legislate on everything everywhere. It was born from a profound need to protect perhaps the most important yet the most fragile pillar of any functioning democracy, free media. And it is not about regulating media. It is about creating the safest possible space for media freedom and media professionals. Why? Because in spite of all soft law guarantees, we still see a great deal of abuse against independent journalists and media professionals. Emilia Sherkan from my country is just one example of a strong independent journalist who has been standing tall and facing the pressure and harassment until today. But there are hundreds alike. With the Media Freedom Act, Emilia and those like her who fight for the truth will have an ally that protects their sources, as journalists would rather face death than reveal their sources. An ally that protects their editorial freedom, that ensures transparency, that allows them to do their job without fear of pressure, threat, or political interference. I would like to thank again the Commission for their bold proposals, to all of the colleagues that I worked with on this file, and I'm looking forward to securing a strong text together with the Council. Every single politician who wakes up in the morning to look for quality news and correct information, founding its activities and actions on this correct information, should know why free press is so important and needs to be protected. Democracy will never survive in the darkness of the unspoken truth. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And I give the floor to the Vice President of the Commission, Vera Jourova. Please.
Madam President, honourable members, I think everything was said in the last sentence of Madam Strugariu about the freedom of speech and the role of media for our democracy. And for me, this is a big moment because all started here in this house. I remember very well the debate in, it was March 2021, when we had just another frustrating debate about what we can and what we cannot do. And we discussed about the political interference into editorial freedom, about the political pressures, about the governmental attempts to silence free media. And I remember myself saying repeatedly, we cannot do anything, we do not have the law. And then in the discussion, being encouraged by your contributions and your similar conviction that the media should be protected better, I heard myself by saying, yes, we will prepare the law. And so here we are today. And I have to continue by thanking the rapporteurs, Madame Verheyen, the rapporteurs of the associated committees, Ms. Strugariu and Mr. Didier, as well as the shadow rapporteurs and members for your intensive work on the European Media Freedom Act. It was not an easy way to get here. The pressures against this law were enormous. And at the beginning, you may remember, many thought that this is mission impossible. I'm so glad we are here today and we discuss seriously about the possible outcome that might create totally new conditions for the European media to flourish, to do the job, and to be the strong pillar of our democracy. Because what was the result of our debate in 2021 was media must not be just another business on our single market. The role for democracy was and is obvious. We worked hard with my colleague Thierry Breton and all the colleagues in the Commission to deliver what many thought was not possible. So what we try to achieve through the law, that we want to put for the first time in EU law that states should not interfere in editorial decisions, that no journalist can be spied on for doing their work, that no public service media should become a propaganda channel of one party. We require transparency of media ownership, transparency and fairness in the allocation of state advertising. We ask the media themselves to take measures to protect editorial independence and disclose conflict of interest. There is a strong focus in the Act on encouraging self-regulation and ethical standards. We also strengthen the European coordination of national media regulators with the European Board for Media Services. We are creating new mechanisms such as a mutual assistance to ensure coordination and solidarity in dealing with serious threats such as Russian propaganda. The Act includes new requirements for Member States which the Member States should follow when it comes to national measures which affect the media and to assess media concentration. Finally, we propose more safeguards for media in the online environment. Honourable members, you have worked intensively and fast on the Media Freedom Act, and I am grateful to see that the Parliament's report recognises the importance of all the building blocks of our proposal. I note with great interest how you want to strengthen further the protection of journalists and the transparency of media markets. I also note the importance of the debate in the Parliament regarding how media content is moderated on very large online platforms. Let me emphasise that the Media Freedom Act is a piece of a broader puzzle. Let me mention the Audiovisual Media Services Directive, the Copyright Directive, and of course also the Digital Services Act and the Code of Practice Against Disinformation. We believe that there is harmony, not cacophony, that all these rules and all these pieces of legislation work very well together. I welcome the ambition of this House to turn this proposal into a reality this year. We don't have much more time, but I am convinced that also with the Spanish presidency we can achieve the goal. I rely on them also. We have the opportunity which we should not miss, and there is an urgency to act. So I want to thank you for your work and looking forward to continuation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Vice President. And now we come to the speakers for the political groups, starting with the EPP group. Tomasz Frankowski, please.
Pani Przewodnicząca.
President, Commissioner, there's no democracy without free media. That's why it became known as the Fourth Estate, and its role in transparency in respect of authority and society has become very important. However, the Fourth Estate has started to lose credibility in the last few years. We're ever more concerned about the trends that we see in some member states of the EU, which really are propaganda and censorship, and that's why we need EU action as soon as possible. The media can form public opinion, and that's why we should be very worried about the increase in fake news. Freedom of expression is a basic human right. The balance of the needs to guarantee that freedom on the one hand and on the other hand protect users is a cautious balance that has to be hit. We also need to protect journalists' sources. That too is a crucial part of guaranteeing media freedom. Some member states offer full protection to journalists who don't want to give away their sources. Even in criminal cases, some member states only give limited protection. Or the protection is just a general legal principle, which is nothing more than fine words. The media have a dual role in culture and an economic role. We think that the Media Freedom Act recognises the challenges faced, offers protection, and I hope will be a foundation which will give the media back their original roles. So congratulations to the rapporteur and the members of the CULT committee for the work that they have done in arriving at this result.
Thank you very much, colleagues. Now, Mr. Smerillo.
Presidente Bicerno, l'atto.
Thank you, President Picciano. The European Media Freedom Act is an opportunity for Europe. The Parliament has made a strong choice about what side it stands on. journalistic independence underpinned by an ambitious regulation. Protecting journalists' sources is an act of civilization. In too many member states, we are witnessing attempts to gag the work of journalists, above all investigative journalists. There are no healthy democracies where journalists cannot work as they should or fall victim to censorship. We know that we need full safeguards here. That's what our provisions will provide. They will cover spyware. They will remove the national security motivation to restrict the protection of journalists and their sources. We cannot accept any compromise that waters down this matter that's so important for us. We must ensure the full independence and autonomy of public service media to guarantee protection from political and government influence. They must have twofold independence: institutional independence in terms of full transparency of the respective boards, and financial independence so that they have adequate state funding. At a time when the public debate is impacted by disinformation, we need to protect public service media. Only if free from political pressure and financial pressure can they fully enjoy press freedom. Article 11 of the Charter of Fundamental Rights of the EU recognises everyone's right to have a pluralist information and news offering. Parliament calls on member states finally to take action on that right, and putting in practice that right guarantees that the big platforms can not act fully autonomously in terms of providing reliable and genuinely independent media. We need balanced rules. Journalists make our democracy stronger.
Thank you. Now I give the floor to Madam Joveva.
Hvala. V obrambi vladavine prava v Evropski uniji so bili
President, we have to fight for the rule of law in the EU, and the media are a prerequisite for the working of our democracies. In some member states, the media are very well placed, but in others, they are submissive and have become a tool of the powers that be. They've become a political tool. I'm thinking of Hungary and Poland. But that risk applies to all member states. No one is immune to that. We've seen cases of espionage. We've seen journalists murdered in Europe. There's concentration of ownership. The media is a pillar of our freedoms, and sometimes they too are put under pressure. Luckily, that's not the case in Slovenia. Here we have EU legislation. It's going to be transparent. Interference and pressures will be resisted. And in that way, we will be able to protect our media. I think it's as much as we can do with this legislation. There is no magic wand that's going to eliminate all problems, of course, but this legislation represents a big step in the right direction, the direction of freedom of the media, and we should be supporting it.
Prego.
Thank you, and I give the floor to Madame Riba-Ijner. Thank you, President, Commissioner. Today, this Parliament is making an urgent step towards protecting democracy in Europe, because, as Kofi Annan said, no democratic society can exist without a free, independent and pluralistic press. There are many examples which show why having a European Medium Freedom Act is so important for the EU. In recent years, we have seen public media transform into a propaganda arm for populist governments. Media monopolies that prevent plurality, governance that spy on critical journalists, and an increase of disinformation, which feeds the extreme right. However, diagnosing these risks is only useful if we have the political will to face them and to find solutions. And that's what we have in this text today. It lays the basis for a sustainable, resilient and plural media environment. We need to have transparency so that citizens know who is behind the news that they read. Independence so that journalists can do their job without any interference or threats. Plurality. We need to take measures against media monopolies. And we also need to protect public media. Their mission should never be compromised by political interference. These means are tools to ensure that our citizens can have better information and with a more critical view. We know the text isn't perfect, and that's why we've proposed amendments to improve it. However, as Maria Ressa said, and as we remember when we read the news coming from Hungary, Poland or Italy, democracy is fragile. We have to fight so that we don't lose a single scrap of it, not a single law, nor any defense, institution or report. We know how dangerous it is if we are subject to cuts in any of this. That's why we have to stand firm. The Greens have always done that and will continue to do so. Thank you. Thank you. Madam Crook.
The proposal here for the European Media Freedom Act brings in provisions that don't relate to the single market. It's a violation of the treaties on the functioning of the EU, which are the legal basis for it. It also interferes in national governments' right to form their own media markets. Provisions on the media in the whole of the EU may end up destroying media systems in the member states. Some parts could be given our support. However, many provisions don't protect the freedom of speech. For example, like the board on media services, which covers other services, radio and audiovisual services. In the Polish constitution, we have a clear statement of the freedom of speech and a ban on censorship of the press. These are a clear guarantee of the independence of the media in our country. No one is questioning freedom of the press. Perhaps the Commission's real goal is to do something other than reinforce the media freedom. Perhaps it wants to go beyond the treaties and impinge on national sovereignty in this area.
Colleagues, please stick to the time you've been allotted. Madam Griset now, please.
Commissioner, colleagues, Edmund Burke, the Irish philosopher, said that the media, even in the 18th century, was the fourth estate, and they haven't continued to increase their influence. They're omnipresent now. This is a huge power of information. It's often envied, but the freedom of the media is one of the foundations of democracy, founded on the freedom of expression and opinion. It's our duty to ensure that this freedom continues to be protected by national laws. There are several fundamental reasons why I'm against this regulation. Firstly, because the Commission is basing itself on bogus arguments that there is a European media market, and then it lies by saying that it aims to protect media freedom. And lastly, because it has imposed a set of binding rules on all of the member states when only some member states are actually targeted. To support that legislative proposal, the Commission tries to grab another national prerogative, saying that everyone should provide information as it sees fit, and then the vote is a consequence of that.
Thank you. And now give the floor to Mr. Kouloglou.
Well, Ms. Commissioner, you said that when we started working on this act, it looked like Mission Impossible. What we managed was exactly what's happening in the cinema. We succeeded in a Mission Impossible. And, well, you know, in my country, Greece, we have all the bad symptoms we are having all over Europe. We have control by the state, by the strong financial interests. We have censorship, self-censorship. We have assassination of journalists, and also we have spying on journalists. So this act is very encouraging. It's coming like a fresh air for us. And that's why including the control of the big platforms is very, very important what now we are doing. You said before that there has been a lot of pressure, but really that's the role of the good parliament, to fight against political outside pressure, to fight against financial interests, to do the good job, and to promote democracy and justice. And I wanted to thank you and all the other colleagues for the work that has been done.
Grazie. Facoltà ora di intervenire.
Thank you. I now give the floor to Mr. Giarrusso.
Colleghi, oggi è indispensabile.
Today, colleagues, we must mention Julian Assange, because whenever we talk about press freedom or rules regarding the press, it's our duty to honour the memory by recalling that without any guilt, Julian Assange, for doing his duty as a journalist, has been cooped up for years. He sought to raise citizens' awareness. I come from Sicily, where unfortunately the mafia have killed journalists like Paolo De Mauro and others, De Fano and others. And all they were guilty of doing was telling the truth. The memory of Daphne Caruana and others who have stood up for the truth have, like Julian Assange, had a living death sentence. We, colleagues, must shout out loud and clear, free Julian Assange, free Assange now.
Grazie. Facoltà ora di intervenire l'onorevole.
Thank you. And I give the floor to Mr. Rangel.
Grazie, Presidente, dear Commissioner. Sabemos que a liberdade de imprensa.
Commissioner, we know that freedom of the press and freedom for journalists and the associations that represent them is essential to our democracy. This Media Freedom Act puts in place conditions that will guarantee the freedom of internal and external communication means. However, in practice, it's only going to be possible if we base this on the freedom of our media. In Slovakia, during the elections, we saw problems similar in Portugal. We saw our Portuguese parties, the S&D, saying absolutely nothing. This is a way that we can influence media. For example, journalists are killed. They spoke out against corruption in Slovakia. They spoke out against the Fico government because they are behind the killing of Jan Kuciak. But in Portugal and in Brussels, the Socialist Party and the S&D have not distanced themselves from what has happened in Slovakia or the government that supports Putin's policies.
Saliba, prego.
Thank you very much, Mr. Saliba.
Grazie, Signora Presidente.
Thank you very much, Madam President. The Act as to the freedom of the press is a piece of legislation which is extremely important, particularly in the times we're living nowadays, where we see many practices around the world which at the end of the day are really concerning as to the freedom of expression, even in the EU. The freedom of the media guarantees to our citizens unfettered access to information. It is also a prerequisite so that they make free choices, democratic free choices, which are informed when they come to electing those who should represent us in power. And that is why we need provisions which are strong on a European level so as to safeguard a number of points. First of all, we protect the freedom of the press. We safeguard freedom from interference by editorial. We also guarantee pluralism through the media, safeguarding also the independence of the media of the public service. And we also ensure that we have an economic environment where free journalism can continue to flourish. And that is why editorial action is crucial in times of misinformation, disinformation, which also comes from third countries. We need full transparency to really know who is speaking behind the media means. That these are priorities we must protect through our vote tomorrow. The elections of the European Parliament are on our doorstep. We therefore need very strong regulations in order to ensure free elections next year. Thank you.
Thank you, colleagues. Please stick to the speaking time, otherwise I'll have to cut you off because we're quite short on time. And I'll give the floor to Madame Farron. Madam President, Vice President, colleagues. The Media Freedom Act is a key step forward in affirming our European values of freedom of information and protection for journalists at European level. Madam Vice President, we are particularly proud because it's the result of an initiative from our political group, Renew. It was our initiative to say that all Europeans have the right to free, independent information. We have to look at media concentration in a more effective manner when it comes to concentration of illiberal powers or when it's private groups of questionable background. I'm particularly satisfied with the fact that my amendment for content generated by AI without any human control is in the text, because this is key to fighting disinformation and to ensure quality journalism in the future. Thank you. And now I give the floor to Mr. Freund.
President, members of the House, this is what media diversity looks like in Hungary under Viktor Orban today.
Colleague, as you know, we can't show images in the room, as you know.
There are no free radio, TV or media in Hungary. The situation is not worse anywhere else in the EU. However, other countries are starting to follow suit. On the right of this House, there are people who only want to see the press praise them rather than criticise them. So protecting media freedom in the EU, it comes at the right time, perhaps a little bit late. What we agree on here will take us a step forward. Protect journalists, transparency about ownership concentration and how much money governments give to media that supports them. We also have to be honest. This proposal won't change the situation in Hungary. When national control fails, the EU must be able to step in defence of media diversity. Orban has complete control over the media, and we have to have a way of putting an end to that. Worried, concerned letters from Brussels won't stop Mr. Orban. We have to actually put that control into place. Orban has to be stopped. The Kashmir have to be stopped. Vote for this report of yours, because otherwise we won't be able to do what we want to do, which is create media freedom.
Thank you. Mr. Teresh has the floor.
Dear colleagues, the discussion here is not about the so-called Media Freedom Act, a label given by the European Commission to this regulation, but the media surveillance Control and Censorship Act, which accurately describe the nature of this regulation. It is unacceptable that the European Commission claims to promote the media freedom while, in fact, this regulation opens the doors for journalists, their employers, and even their families to be subjected to surveillance and spying by the security agencies. As the shadow rapporteur in Libe for the ECR group, I table amendments aimed to eliminate the provisions that permit such spying and surveillance on journalists, but they were rejected by EPP, S&D, and Renew. Joseph Stalin said, and I quote, "The press is our party's sharpest and most powerful weapon." Clearly, under the leadership of Ursula von der Leyen, the European Commission does not desire a free press, but rather a propaganda machine, which is tightly controlled and subjected to surveillance like it was in the Soviet Union. The dangerous precedent established by the so-called Media Freedom Act regulation will have unreceivable and devastating consequences for democracy and freedom of the speech throughout the European Union, which is why I ask the Parliament to heavily reject it. Thank you.
Grazie. Facoltà ora di intervenire l'onorevole.
Thank you. I'll now give the floor to Mr. Darre.
Presidente.
Thank you, President. The draft regulation on the media freedom establishes standards for the internal market for information. This is an ambitious project to protect pluralism in the media within the European single market. However, there'll be a European supervisory body rather than national. Clearly, interference from the freedom of national information has to be prevented, because this could lead to additional limits on national politics if they don't respect Brussels and lead to infringement procedures, perhaps. We don't want to see any interference from the European Union, because freedom of press is one of the key principles of our democracy. Thank you, Madam Daly.
Grazie, Presidente. Later today, we'll vote on whether to ban the deployment of spyware against journalists in the EU. The Media Freedom Act is the very first time the EU is going to legislate on the issue of spyware, a technology described by Edward Snowden as being like a nuclear weapon. And it is. There are no circumstances where its deployment is in line with fundamental rights. It takes over your devices, spies on your every move, everyone you come into contact with. It can even send messages from those devices. It obliterates the very concept of privacy and undermines the right to a fair trial. And as it currently stands, we are today proposing to empower governments, private entities and more to use it against journalists. Now, for God's sake, we never stop talking in here about defending journalists, the danger of authoritarianism, freedom to the media. If you care about defending journalists, you must ban spyware. It's the least you can do. Support our amendments in this regard.
Grazie. A facoltà ora di intervenire l'onorevole.
Thank you. The next speaker is Simčić. Mr. Simčić.
Hvala vam lijepo. Europski akt o slobodi.
Thank you. The European Media Freedom Act. Well, we know that it's going to be implemented in cooperation with the fact-checkers. In Croatia, the freedom of media is very low. The ruling party is paying for the ads so that those media would write favorably about the government. Mr. Plenković, our Prime Minister, is pushing through a Media Act which will empower the publishers to reject the publication of critical articles, and also editors will be able to force the journalists to reveal their sources. Of course, the use of Facebook and other social media might be an outlet for those freedoms, but there we have the fact checkers waiting for them in ambush. We're talking about the erosion of freedoms. We're talking about the failure to respect the scientific debate, scientific facts. We saw that during the COVID crisis, how the fact checkers operated in that area, and we now have.
Thank you, Mr. Thompson, please.
Hvala lepa za besedo, spoštovana gospa predsednica, podpredsednica komisije, gospa Jourova.
Thank you, Madam President. Madam Vice President of the Commission, Mrs. Jourova, in this new legislation, you above all emphasise measures to protect the public media. You're talking about the mandate of the administration and the various measures to protect against pressure. In Slovenia, we have witnessed an incident which is completely against this legislation. The left-wing coalition changed the legislation that will now allow for the suppression of the voices of journalists who don't agree with them. We're talking about Slovenian radio television. You were aware of this, you did nothing against it, even when you were claiming that you were protecting journalists. So why have you said nothing? Is it because the Slovenian government belongs to a party you're close to? In the case of Slovenia, you're not supporting editorial independence nor the public media, but you are protecting those who are destroying all of that. Can you explain to the citizen of Slovenia what you plan to do to demonstrate your credibility this time? What do you plan to do to palliate the effects of what has been done to damage Slovenian media freedom? Will you yourself respect your own legislation?
Oncheva, prego.
Thank you, Mrs. Joncheva.
Уважаеми колеги,
colleagues, we do propose a Media Act which hopefully will change the media medium. Subordinated media, pressure on journalists by governments and business interests, coalescence between political power and media. This is the reality in Europe today. And the decline of trust to the public and private media is logically reaching a critical low. The purpose of this act is not to impose censorship or regulate the media. The purpose is to loosen the grip of business and authority and create conditions for independent journalism. The European Parliament today is about to guarantee protection of journalists from pressure and the use of any methods of wiretapping or spying. We propose clear measures to shed light on the property, on the ownership of media and their financial sources. We put an end to the arbitrary, to the slanted distribution of euro funds. Colleagues, the European Act for the Freedom of Media is the result of hard work and years of pressure. The hard negotiations with the member states are ahead of us. Hopefully today, with a vast majority, we'll take a first initial step to restoring the freedom and independence of journalism in Europe. And I would like to thank the Commissioner Jourova for having done this.
Thank you. Mrs. Pagaza-Ortundua.
Gracias, Presidenta. Thank you, President. Commissioner, without truth, there is no democracy. Without journalism, which is truthful and verified information, there is no democracy. Protecting journalists and journalism is therefore one of the 2 or 3 most important challenges of the 21st century. And I'm speaking personally here. For me, this act remains half done. Does self-qualification serve to have the effects of means of communication? No. Is it an extra guarantee? Is an extra guarantee needed for online media against possible arbitrary large platforms? Yes. Article 17 of the Culture Committee could be improved, but it's better than the Commission's proposal because the Commission once again runs away when it comes to handling this issue of harmful or illegal content and passes the buck back to large platforms and generates problems. This article is not ready, and we're going to pass on the responsibility to much more opaque negotiations between Parliament and Council. However, this is public law, and what we're doing is undermining trust in legal certainty, and this is what we need. And the gaps that we are leaving will allow populists to come in and to enter power, and once we'll convert this into personal opportunism.
Prego.
Thank you, Mr. Kalaya, please.
Thank you, Madam President, Vice President, colleagues. We have been waiting for this legislation for years, and finally we got here today. The attempts to paralyze free media, to destroy critical voices, to attack journalists have multiple names in Europe. Orbán, Babiš, Kaczynski, Janša. They hate free media. To silence, to take control, to make them starve. That is their recipe to destroy the voices that criticize them. That is why the European Media Freedom Act is one of the main successes of this Parliament in fighting against oligarchs and in preserving democracy and the rule of law in Europe. At last, there will be an instrument that will oblige media to be transparent about their ownership structures. There will be a database of media owners where every citizen will easily find out who stands behind the newspaper they read. For instance, do you find out that an owner of a news service also owns coal mines? Well, it easily explains why they constantly write in their news that our fight against the climate change is counterproductive. What I have personally fought for and consider my biggest success in this legislation is a ban on media ownership for top politicians, prime ministers, ministers, commissioners. Coming from Czechia, I had experienced years of buyouts of free media by a media tycoon and a prime minister in one person. For once, Andrej Babiš has been an inspiration for my work. Needless to say, a horrendous one. Thank you.
L'onorevole Ruohonen Lerner.
Thank you. Ruohonen Lerner.
Thank you, President. Media independence and diversity are, of course, important objectives. In Sunday speeches, everything seems to be fine. We have democracy in most EU countries, and media is said to be independent. However, reality may be different more than we think. And now I talk about Finland, whose media landscape I know the best. In Finland, I've come across with situations where media independence has been affected directly by ownership, by media owners themselves, especially those media owners who are active in politics or support politicians in elections can easily influence media contents and in this way obtain positive press and election success for themselves and the candidates they support. This often leads to good business as well. Of course, there's a risk of reduced credibility sooner or later. Therefore, I welcome the objective that media ownership should be made more transparent. Thank you.
Facoltà ora di intervenire l'onorevole Le Breton.
Thank you, Mr. Le Breton.
Chers collègues,
ladies and gentlemen, freedom of the media is a fundamental principle that anyone sincerely devoted to liberal democracy must defend. But nevertheless, I disapprove of the text submitted for our agreement for three reasons. Firstly, media freedom is the exclusive competence of the member states. The legal base chosen to justify the interference of the EU, Article 174 of TFEU, is completely wrong. As the French National Assembly, the Hungarian National Assembly and the Bundesrat have said, then the instrument, the regulation, not a directive, expresses the attempt of the EU to impose media conformism on the national press. And then lastly, horrifyingly, it's about taming the media that resist European heterodoxy in France, as far as Vincent Bolloré's group is concerned, in Hungary and elsewhere. You say media is in danger, but in fact it's the EU that threatens it. Thank you.
Intervenire l'onorevole Pignedoli.
Mrs. Pignedoli.
Cari colleghi, la sicurezza...
Colleagues, national security is not a sufficient motive to surveil, spy on journalists and make them keep quiet. In Europe, sovereignty belongs to the people, and they have the right to know the truth, including about state structures that are focusing on interests other than the common good. If we're to allow this national security exemption in the regulation, it's very risky, because it means that it might undermine the work that we've done on pluralism, transparency and independence of the media. It's also important to protect journalism from concentration of ownership from the large online platforms. We agree that we want to avoid disinformation, but what is disinformation? Are we not running the risk of just allowing mainstream thought to circulate? And that way we will eliminate critical voices under this excuse. I just have to remind you that other opinions are not disinformation.
Zicchi, prego.
Thank you, Mr. Haltzicki.
Szanowni Pani...
President, Commissioner, members of the House, the Media Freedom Act is perhaps the most important piece of legislation of this parliamentary term. There are important projects, the budget and what have you, but without the free media, without protecting journalists' rights, we won't have free elections, we won't have democracy. I think that goes without saying. This document is the result of the successful work of 2 parliamentary committees and the investigative, the Committee of Inquiry on the Pegasus scandal. Journalists must be protected, as must their sources, and we should honour those journalists who have died in exercising their profession. The negotiation work has been rapid. I'm a little bit worried to see these empty seats here. And I'm not surprised to hear the Polish Law and Justice Party express a negative opinion about this document, because they're worried about freedom of expression. I call on the Council to adopt this document as quickly as possible. Thank you.
Intervenire l'onorevole Schaldamose.
Thank you, Mrs. Schaldamose, please.
Ytringsfriheden og de frie medier er grundstenen i vores.
Thank you. The free expression of opinion, the freedom of the press, these are the cornerstones of our democracy, and it always has been. The press that worked in the underground during the world wars, or Charlie Hebdo included. And now there's a new threat to our media. We see that there are major online platforms acting as a clearinghouse, gathering things together. That's fine, but there are some platforms with opaque rules, and free media articles disappear on them. That's not okay. That worries me, and that's why I'm happy that this European Media Freedom Act will carry on the work that we put in place with the Digital Services Act, which began it. We are strengthening media freedom, and censorship and opaque rules must be kept away. It can't be Musk or Zuckerberg who determine what articles are supplied, but free publishers.
Συγχαρητήρια στους συναδέλφους και την Επίτροπο Γιούροβα για την καλή δουλειά.
Thank you. I would like to congratulate colleagues and commissioners for the work that you've done. We have to fight for freedom of expression, but we have terrible obstacles in our way, particularly in Greece and in comparison with other of the 27 member states. And I'm speaking as a former journalist and the former owner of a former media owner. My media was suppressed. The information that we wanted to publish was not allowed to be published for 18 months. Pressure from the government meant that we were not able to do our work. We have to continue our fight against this.
Mrs. Geser.
Wussten Sie, dass unsere Kollegen...
Did you know that Hannah Neumann is being slandered on an Italian media site? It was said that she was corrupt and that she was involved in Qatargate. That is a multiple series of lies that damages this House. Now, this colleague was able to get the article taken down and defend herself, but by that stage it had got so far around the internet that her name was associated with that in internet searches. Information moves very quickly around the internet. Sound, researched journalistic work can't keep up with the algorithms that push information. Article 17 is going to allow fake news, and the Hungarian press is using its own regulatory body to allow this information. So please vote for the Article 17 deletion amendment. Media freedom is important, but citizens also have a right not to be overcome by a flood of lies.
Mrs. Chagnon. In politics, nothing comes about by chance. That's what was said by a former US president in a debate on media freedom. Now, this legislation is coming to a head, and you've already applied pressure, threats and financial sanctions against the countries that refuse your dictate. You are using this final strait to try and seize control of the media against the people and putting nation against nation. Your draft is aimed at media surveillance and a framework of rules that work around the back of national parliaments with the legitimately elected members of those. And there should be no discordant voice for you against the Commission. And that's why you did this on the 9th of June. Press freedom means, above all, respect for the plurality of opinion. And this is a particular serious issue, media freedom. You shouldn't act as you are to try and tether it. And this just underlines your disdain for the historic democratic values of our continent. Thank you, Mr. Kolakusic.
Media and truth. In order to go back to normal human values, CNN, Reuters, Associated Press, Deutsche Welle, and similar media fanatics and Taliban should be declared terrorist organizations. During the so-called pandemics and forced wars, they have been producing an enormous amount of fake information, spreading hatred among people and nations. And as a consequence, we now have millions of victims throughout Europe and the world. This is not an act on the freedom of media. It is an act on the freedom to spread fake news and hatred, leading the world back into the dark days of totalitarianism. Thank you.
Mr. Bilčík, please.
Pani podpredsednička,
colleagues, the European Media Freedom Act is an excellent news for media and democracy. In Slovakia, we have been facing foreign intervention by the Russian Federation for years, and specifically from the beginning of the Russian aggression in Ukraine. Russia spreads its influence via disinformation, fake news, and various clandestine websites. Political big shots also help them. And please, let us not turn a blind eye to it. I'm also talking about Ficos Smer, that won the parliamentary elections in Slovakia on Saturday. That is why we need strong, high quality and healthy media environment. We need to constantly and persistently protect the independence of the media and journalists, to give them greater freedom in their work, to make them able to bring verified information. It is a prerequisite for democracy, not only in Slovakia, but all over the world. We need journalists to be able to focus on their work and not on the consequences of their work for themselves and their families. I am glad that this Media Freedom Act is a modern act which reflects how unbelievably the media environment has changed in the past decades. That big media platforms are the media market stakeholders, and they cannot pretend that they do not have anything in common with the media environment. They do. They co-created, and we have to react to this reality. Influence is joined with responsibility. Journalists in a healthy information environment are our health, and one of the prerequisites for a viable democracy. Like many colleagues said, we know where aggressive attacks against journalists lead. We know how societies where fair and objective reporting is jeopardized look like. Just always remember Jan Kuciak and Daphne Galizia Caravano. I believe that our new European legislation will be a strong instrument for freedom and high quality.
Thank you very much. Madam Guillaume, please.
Madame la Présidente,
Madam President, Vice President, colleagues, we began examining this regulation a long time ago. It's going to determine how we guarantee freedom of the press and pluralism of the media in Europe. When we were reflecting on the threats and dangers facing us, certain countries sprang immediately to mind because the situation of the media in those countries was of concern. Since then, these bad examples have shown that freedom of the press is actually under threat everywhere in Europe, in all of our member states. Freedom of the press is fragile, and this regulation is not going to be a luxury. It allows us to analyse very specific and sometimes sensitive situations, questions of media concentration, editorial independence, and questions of protecting journalistic sources, which is something we cannot back down on. These provisions will be safeguards to protect the freedom of the press, journalists, and the pluralism of the media, which is what democracy depends on.
Thank you. Ms. Assolani, please.
Thank you, Madam Speaker, Madam Commissioner, esteemed colleagues. This union defends democracy. Let that be heard. When authoritarian leaders within our union are silencing the voices of those who oppose them, we will push back. When disinformation sows its dark seeds, online or offline, we will shut them down. When journalists are attacked, spied on, or silenced or prosecuted, we will protect them. When politicians can't keep their hands off the free media, we will slap their fingers. When free speech is threatened or silent, we will slam a big-ass law on the European table. Because this union protects democracy, let that be heard. Thank you.
Grazie.
Thank you very much. I'd like to give the floor now to Mr. Comon.
Merci, Madame la Présidente.
Thank you very much, President. A journalist, Ms. Lavrieux, was arrested at her home, and the house was searched. A media outlet that was bought by a billionaire, and an audiovisual company that was completely deprived of its financing. All of this makes the European Media Freedom Act a necessity for all of Europe, because the threats that I just listed to you are not things that are taking place just in Poland and Hungary. They also are taking place in my country, France. The European Parliament should strengthen this new regulation. We know that vis-à-vis the Council, negotiations are going to be extremely difficult. Many of our governments do not hide the fact that they are fighting freedom, including France, and there is a threat against media by the government of Macron. This is shameful for Europe. I count on the Parliament and the Commission to not let this take place. Thank you.
Prego.
Mr. Wilinski, please.
Danke sehr.
Thank you very much. Ladies and gentlemen, the EU is looking at the topic of freedom. We have the impression we're asking a dog to look after a sausage. That doesn't work. We've seen it with the Service Act. Czech news is threatened by political bodies, and we want the authorities to check what is fake news and not, what is propaganda and not. I don't know how you can have the idea of having that done by a political body. I'm in favour of media freedom and plurality and democracy, and authorities must never select what is true and not. We have the limits of criminal law for that, and what we're talking about, areas of freedom in media. You can't have the idea of having a European authority which should judge whether media freedom exists or not. I think that who want to open up the whole area, I think that's the wrong way. If the EU would like to do something, we should have prosperity and the right to speak freely for everybody, and not what we're doing here.
Thank you. Now, Ms. Zadnolka, please.
Thank you. Algirdas Paleckis, Lithuania, suffering 6-year sentence in prison in Kaunas. Vladimir Slindermans, Latvia, his trial will start in 1 hour in Riga. Both are prosecuted just for doing their job as journalists. I pose the question whether the new Media Freedom Act will help to avoid such situation and stop prosecution of journalists. Will the new board be able to do it? No. No in such a proposal where this board will consist just of functionaries delegated by member states. There is another version, just to hold pan-European elections. Elections of the board where very famous, well-known journalists are standing for elections and to hold them alongside with European Parliament elections. It's not my idea. It's the idea of famous Italian journalist Giulietta Chiesa. And the same approach can be applied to national elections of this supervisory board on media. Only in this case we can achieve the goals posed and formulated in the European Media Freedom Act. Thank you.
Grazie, colleghi. Tempi. Thank you very much. Just keep an eye on the time, and I'd like to give the floor now to Ms. Fukunen, please.
Madam President, Commissioner, free independent media is a cornerstone of our democracy. And we, as politicians, we have to protect media freedom, also in the cases when maybe they are criticizing us in the news. Freedom of expression and rule of law, they are core values of the European Union. It's a shame that we have member states where journalists are oppressed or spied, or even murdered because of their work for sharing information. This Media Freedom Act is well needed. We have to protect media pluralism and freedom everywhere in the EU. Digitalization poses also new challenges for journalism, when citizens are often getting their news via social media, and then it's actually the online platform that decides which content is shown for the users. We already have now the Digital Service Act, which brings more transparency to the very large online platforms. Now this legislation on media freedom offers additional protection against the unjustified removal of professional media content, and this is well needed.
Thank you. I'd like to give the floor now to Ms. Che.
Dear colleagues, imagine beginning your day with a cup of coffee and your trusted local newspaper. You flip through the pages, catch up on the latest news on town, from education to traffic update, cultural events. You finish up with the results of the local sports team and the weekend's fish soup cooking contest. It's like not such an unusual image, is it? And now imagine that you wake up one day and all of that is gone. And in the same newspaper, now you can read about the many achievements of your great leader, Viktor Orban, or about totally absurd conspiracies on Brussels forcing sex change operations on toddlers. Well, colleagues, this is what has happened in Hungary. 400 local newspapers were merged into one single monstrous conglomerate called Kesma, which is stuffed with taxpayers' money. State advertising makes up 75% of its ad revenue. And Orban's favorite oligarch, Lőrinc Mészáros, has control over all of it. And for too long, we have waited for the EU to address this blatant attack on media freedom. Now, the European Media Freedom Act is finally a step in the right direction because it directly confronts the critical problem of media market concentration. The 15% ceiling on state advertising could be an absolute game changer. And our democracies will be healthier if it's implemented. Thank you very much.
Grazie, onorevole. C'è una blue card per lei.
Madam, there is a blue card for you from Ms. Jambaski. The floor is yours.
Уважаеми колега, критикувате много силно медиите концентрирани. Има ли превод? Can you hear?
You criticize the media. I hope you can hear the translation.
Let's say Mr. Orban's friends. What about media owned by another figures? For example, a lot of media in Bulgaria are related, connected, or owned by circles close to Mr. Soros. What is your opinion? Because they are forming public opinion in Sofia. How will you comment this? Thank you.
I suppose this is why we need a strong European-level regulation so that it can create a level and equal playing field for every media ownership. And this is why I think it's very essential to have European-level regulation. Thank you.
Grazie. Facoltà ora di intervenire.
Thank you very much. I'd like to give the floor now to Mr. Simon.
Frau Präsidentin,
Madam President, colleagues, the media freedom law is an important step in promoting and protecting freedom of expression and plurality in Europe. We are worried about media concentration. We want to establish standards for public broadcasting, protection of sources, and prevent the installation of spyware. And, of course, this is a European issue. But as always, when the EU tries to harmonise something, people are concerned that national systems are going to be changed by European regulation. But in this case, I think that journalists will benefit from this legislation in all countries because lack of pluralism in the media is a problem in more member states than we would actually assume. And I'm very grateful to Sabine Verheyen, my colleague, for having brought her immense experience to bear and a lucid eye to this legislation. Because when I hear what is coming from the extreme right wing, it sounds as if freedom of the media is in danger when the Europeans try to regulate. And so I think today is a good day for press freedom and pluralism. So many thanks to Sabine Verheyen and all the colleagues who worked so constructively on this file.
Sorry.
Thank you. You have a blue card.
For you. L'onorevole Jonka.
Mr. Jonka.
Dziękuję bardzo. I will speak Polish. Proszę pana, oskarża pan prawicę.
Colleague, I have a question. You talk about the right. You talk about media concentration on the right. What do you say to that? Perhaps here in the European Parliament we could have a ranking of ownership structures of the media throughout Europe. Why I'm asking this? In Poland, 50% of the press has a German owner and 70% of the TV also has foreign owners. My question is, perhaps we should take a look at that. the ownership structure of media throughout Europe. What does it look like?
Verständlich, natürlich so.
Yes, of course we should look at this, and we are looking at this. It is all transparent, this information is accessible, but there's a big difference. Media concentration. The question of which media are held in the ownership of one person or other is one thing, but the abuse of a monopoly position and the intimidation of journalists is something else, and that is what is happening in the country in question in a serious way.
Thank you now. Ms. Zovko, please.
Poštovana predsjednice, poštovana povjerenice.
Madam President, Commissioner, today, here we are looking at the European Media Freedom Act, and I should like to thank our rapporteur, Mrs. Verheyen, who factored in a number of amendments. Now, this meant that this act really assisted in strengthening the transparency of media outlets. Member states will have to respect these rules, and it will also address state advertising and a heightened level of transparency in this context. Lest we forget, the freedom of media is something that is absolutely crucial within the member states, and therefore, by way of conclusion, I'd like to pay homage to someone who, J.P. McLeman, during the war in Croatia, fought for media freedom, for the media from Yugoslavia spread lies, and this American citizen waged a war in editorials during the war, meaning that citizens really know the truth. Today, Europe is different. Nonetheless, we must defend media so that we make sure that authoritarian regimes cannot control the media outlets. Thank you. Mr. Mandel, please.
Thank you very much, Madam President, colleagues. If we talk about the great innovations, we talk about book printing or electricity, penicillin maybe, but also press freedom is a huge innovation, just like parliamentarism. And we defend press freedom in Europe in difficult times because in the internet age, we have so much negative in the media, disinformation, hate speech, fake news, this splitting of our societies. So press freedom is so important. It means that we can have information which is checked, which is researched, that you can trust, because journalists are behind it, who know their job and like doing it and have ethical standards. And that's the big difference. Just like with food, we wouldn't eat toxic food, but we're all confronted with toxic information. To have good, reliable information, research information, that's why we have press freedom, and that's something we consider very important in Europe.
Now we have 10 minutes because at noon we must vote, as you well know. Therefore, we won't be able to take all of the speakers under Catch the Eye. I'd like to begin now with Ms. Glavak, please.
Eccola lì, prego.
Hvala lijepa predsjedavajuća, poštovana povjerenice, prije svega želim zahvaliti.
Thank you very much, Madam President. First of all, I would like to thank Ms. Verheyen for this excellent document. As a former journalist, I welcome everything that the Parliament is proposing here. The digital transformation is a powerful force for change, and therefore, we must pay very close attention to developments. Journalists face huge challenges, and it's very difficult to distinguish between the truth and fake news. Journalists, of course, play an important role because they have to address this analysis every day. I think we need to protect media freedom, and I welcome the new board that is going to be set up. It's a big step forward in order to protect pluralism and the diversity of the media in Europe and to develop this further. I believe there are other measures too that would strengthen media pluralism and protect it further from inadmissible interference from spy software and intimidation. And of course, finally, the protection of journalists is not just the protection of the profession, it's the protection of democracy.
Thank you, Mr. Lopez Aguilar. Without free access to information, we don't have any democracy. And we know this. We've known this now for 250 years, since the establishment of the US, and the EU also is well aware of this. Freedom of the press is fundamental, hence the proposal that we are making here. We need transparency, independence of media outlets, protection from slap cases against journalists or any threats or persecution of them. This is a correct step in the right direction for history, and it's important in the implementation of the Charter of Fundamental Rights in the EU. What we need to know is that it is time for information, media, and press be a part of the fundamental rights of the democracy. And we know that the Commission informs the Libby Committee on this consistently. We think that this should be a part of their information that they provide. Thank you very much. Mr. Keller.
European Media Freedom Act, and we have to ensure and protect the integrity of journalism and the media profession itself. Not every government is a benign one that, will allow media to flourish, to be plural and to be diverse, and we've seen that in Europe, the rowing back of civil rights, of fundamental rights in certain areas, and that also means the rowing back of the freedom of the media. It includes intimidation and persecution, and the use of AI and spyware and many others in observing and monitoring journalism is something that we have to root out. So I do support any measures in that context. The over-concentration of media ownership is a significant issue. Of course, the most important thing is that we don't have an over-concentration of editorial influence, and that clearly is a very significant challenge today, not only in terms of monopolies, from an economic perspective, but ensuring that we have a plural, diverse editorial content across our media platforms and our media in general in the European Union. The starting emphasis should be that press freedom is a cornerstone of democracy, and if we want to uphold democracy and the integrity of it, the media freedom, pluralism and diversity of content is critically important.
Onorevole Brickman.
Mr. Mickman.
Chère à nos valeurs européennes, la liberté de
The press freedom is the cornerstone of our democracy. It must become a model so that we can defend the rights of journalists throughout the world. For years here, we denounce threats to the press freedom throughout Europe, given assassinations and arrests of journalists, control and concentration of media, surveillance and intimidation, violation of source secrecy and other protections. The absence of the Council today is very striking. The Media Freedom Act is a set of rules for press freedom, pluralism and protection of journalists in Europe. But the moment is come for one of the recommendations of our Pegasus Committee of Inquiry, a ban on spying on journalists. That's a message to our governments above all. Press freedom is fundamental for the rule of law and democracy. It's necessary at the time of huge disinformation. Let's protecting it and let's re-establish it. Thank you.
Mr. Ilčić, please.
Poštovani kolege, imamo ovako veliku regulativu klasičnih medija i
Thank you very much. A classic regulation on media would be what we need, and here we have a small one for Google, Facebook, etc. And for traditional media outlets, we should have a more limited approach. We have promoters of a certain ideology here. We have an accessible space for all. And in the past, we recognized the fact that there was a censorship regulation, but not for those who were in charge of the media outlets. So until we can find a level playing field, this will not be effective. This report is a report that is missing the mark for us to be able to defend true and fair information. The question is this something that we did on purpose or not?
Grazie, Presidente. Been touted as a measure to protect media pluralism and independence in the EU. Yet every European civil liberties group worth its salt are up in arms about a number of measures in the text that put media pluralism and independent media in the firing line. For example, Article 17, which will create a two-tier media system in the online world. Very large online platforms such as Twitter and Facebook will be entrusted with media content moderation powers based on a system of self-declaration of media outlets that both privileges legacy media groups and allows for those groups to publish false stories that may remain on the site for long enough that the disinformation has spread for long enough already and done its damage before it is taken down through a mediation process. Article 17 is a dangerous provision that's tailor-made for abuse, as is Article 4, which proposes to empower governments and others to use spyware against journalists. This is madness. Vote against Articles 4 and 17.
Colleagues, I just want to clarify that we accepted only one request per political group for Catch the Eye, and we took first come, first serve. I'd like to give the floor now to Commissioner Jourova to reply. Thank you.
Madam President, honourable members, thank you very much for a very interesting and important debate. Well, not everybody was happy and is happy about and with the European Media Freedom Act. That's democracy. And I think that the overall result of this discussion is that we might be entering a very important phase of trialogue when we will try to find the best solution for better protection of journalistic sources, protection against the spyware, also to set the well-working and good system to balance the powers of the online platforms and the media. Because several of you mentioned that the role of media in fight against disinformation, well, this is indispensable, and this is something which also has to be protected as a role of media, while, of course, always keeping the freedom of speech and pluralism in opinions. We do not want, and we are not regulating opinions, but we want to prepare better conditions for those who have the power and who are professionals to get the facts right. I want to react in the remaining 40 seconds on the criticism. Yes, we do have a legal competence to do that. It was confirmed by the legal service of the Council. And yes, we need the Media Freedom Act because we do not want to get to the situation which I experienced 25 years of my life in communist regime. One state, one party, one doctrine, and state information monopoly. Forget it, this will not happen in the EU, and I think that the Media Freedom Act is a very good solution and tool against that. Last words go to Madame Diana Riba. You mentioned Maria Reza. I will meet her in Japan in a few days, and she told me last time we met how she loves the Media Freedom Act. And so I will deliver, I hope, good news that we are going in the direction of having this adopted. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Before I give the floor to the rapporteur, I should like to call on the colleagues to please be quiet. Could we please allow the speakers to speak without disruption?
Thank you very much, dear colleagues, for this very intense debate. And thank you also to all the teams, the secretariats, the offices of my shadow rapporteurs, and of course the shadow rapporteurs, who did an excellent job. With the Cult Committee text, I think we have a watertight text which doesn't encroach on the competence of member states. It simply guarantees fundamental principles, the independence of the free media in a well-functioning democracy. The media board will follow on from the ERGA, and clearly it has to be independent from everybody, including from the Commission, thanks to the work of the Parliament, thanks to the work of the committee and Daniel Freund. The Commission could already intervene more strenuously if it wasn't following EU legislation in the AVSMD or the DSA. We need to guarantee the independence of the board. It's essential. Whatever the political colour of the Commission, the important thing is that the board is independent, regardless of whether the Commission is of one political hue or another. I think the Libe Committee's compromise rules out what was criticised by Mrs. Ilčić. The protection of sources should not be subject to spying, and any spyware would require a legal order. And Article 17, let me clarify, media services should not be dependent on the arbitrary decisions of national regulatory boards. If they come into conflict with the views of the platforms, they can turn directly to the European board and explain their position. So there are all sorts of safeguards built in to avoid interference from third countries, to avoid political arbitrary decisions and institutional arbitrary decisions. So it does offer safeguards and guarantees. It is a balanced and legally watertight legislative text, so I would urge you to vote in favour of this today so that we can really protect media freedom and also freedom and democracy. And I would like to thank the Commission once again for the constructive cooperation, and also look forward to cooperation with the Spanish presidency, and I do hope that we will manage to get this file through before the end of the year. Thank you very much.
Excellent. Thank you very much. This brings the debate to a conclusion. As you know, we will be voting on this file today. We continue our sitting now with the commemoration of the 10-year anniversary of the tragedy in Lampedusa with a statement by the President. Thank you.